Versailles glittered beneath the unblinking gaze of the Sun King, but behind its gilded doors a darker current swirled on that would erupt in a murder so shocking it would stain the heart of Louis XIV's court forever. It began with whispers of poison drifting through candlelit salons, of noble hands reaching for power through powders and potions mixed in shadowed chambers. When an aristocrat was found dead under circumstances too deliberate to be fate, the scandal uncoiled like smoke, entwining the highest ranks of the realm. What followed was not merely an investigation, but a purge where loyalty was questioned, alliances shattered, and even the king's closest intimates stood beneath the shadow of suspicion. This was the killing that changed everything. Versailles did not breathe it, shimmered, suffocated, and watched. Beneath ceilings of painted heavens and among corridors that echoed with silk, the court of Louis XIV moved to a rhythm that was both divine and deadly, where each footstep echoed centuries of ritual and every glance carried the weight of survival. Gold leaf clung to every cornice and curtain, mirrors multiplied the illusion of endless wealth, and yet, behind the gleaming façade, the palace was a pressure chamber, carefully calibrated to orbit a single star, the king himself. From the moment dawn split the horizon, noblemen assembled like actors, rehearsing their devotion in the elaborate theater of the lever, when the monarch awoke not as a man but as a god reborn. Those allowed to pass the threshold of his bedchamber savored it as a triumph greater than conquest. To hand him his glove was a political privilege, to fasten his shoe, a dynastic opportunity. But in this dazzling architecture of control, every favor cast a shadow. Men and women smiled through clenched ambition, their words lacquered with charm and calculation. Hierarchies nested within hierarchies. Dukes bowed to ministers, mistresses outmaneuvered queens, and behind fans or folded letters, alliances shifted like loaded dice. To be noticed by the king meant influence, but influence drew envy, and envy in Versailles could be fatal. It was a world where fortunes were won with a raised eyebrow and lost with a misplaced whisper. A dropped handkerchief could signal ruin. The marble halls bore witness to silent executions not of bodies, but of reputations. One wrong phrase at supper, one rumor seated at a masked ball, and a duke could find his invitations vanish, his titles questioned, his enemies emboldened. In this ecosystem of beauty and betrayal, proximity to power was the currency of life, but the closer one drifted to the Sun King, the more one risked burning. And at the center of it all stood Louis, resplendent in lace and velvet, whose very glance could sculpt careers or silence families. He crafted Versailles not merely as a home, but as a gilded cage where he could see, test, and bend the nobility who once defied his father's crown. They came willingly, peacocks in powdered wigs, offering their dignity in exchange for closeness. They danced, conspired, and kneeled each, believing they could touch divinity and remain untouched. But beneath the perfume and pageantry, there festered a quiet rot. Not all battles were fought with swords. Some were stirred into wine, crushed into powders, or whispered into the ears of alchemists. And as the court grew more golden, the secrets beneath it grew darker. Versailles was not merely a palisade, was a crucible, and its light, for all its brilliance, cast shadows long enough to hide the instruments of murder. In the spaces between music and incense, something malevolent had begun to stir, and the glittering machinery of monarchy would soon grind against something far more ancient and treacherous than treason: poison. It began, as many things at Versailles did, with a couve strange, wet rasp that echoed down a corridor hung with tapestries too rich to muffle dread. The Vicomte de la Reynie, a man of moderate means but recently inflated fortunes, collapsed midway through a game of trick-track in the Salon de Diane, his fingertips twitching as if plucking invisible strings, his skin blanched to the color of melted wax. Within moments, his breath came in frantic gasps, pupils dilated, and a dark foam threaded from the corner of his mouth, staining his lace cravat like rot blooming on snow. Physicians were summoned at once, fanning through his chambers with tinctures and Latin diagnoses, but even their hushed arguments failed to veil the obvious. The Vicomte had died not from illness or age, but from something swift, precise, and unnatural. They said his stomach had blackened. They said his tongue had blistered. They said he screamed not in pain, but in accusation. Within hours, the murmurs began out in the salons. where eyes watched too closely, but in kitchens and linen halls, where gossip thrived in the steam. A poisoned cordial, some claimed, delivered by a servant in the king's livery. Others spoke of a pastry laced with crushed Spanish flies, or a velvet pouch hidden in his pillow, releasing a noxious vapor as he slept. The whispers were carried on silver trays and tucked behind fans, traveling from scullery maids to valets, from footmen to chamberlains, until by the following day, the story had reached the apartments of the Duchesse d'Epernon, who clutched her breast and asked aloud, though not too loudly, if death had returned to court in the form of powder. Old fears stirred from the ashes of the Brinvilliers affair, when poison had stalked the streets of Paris in widows' veils and priests' robes. The Vicomte, though not beloved, had recently received a modest appointment, nothing grand, but enough to inspire envy, and that was all the motive Versailles required. What unsettled the courtiers most was not the death itself, but how easily it could have been them. The Vicomte dined often at the royal table, touched the same chalices, shared cards and confidences. The proximity was too close, too casual, too damning. Suddenly, glances sharpened at breakfast. Servants found themselves questioned not about protocol, but about who entered which room, who accepted which glass, who appeared nervous, distracted, pale. Candied almonds were left untouched. Decanters sat corked, and as silence thickened in drawing rooms, the most dangerous alchemy took hold not of mercury and belladonna, but of suspicion. Versailles, a palace built to exalt a single man's glory, had begun to echo with the first murmur of paranoia. Something unseen had pierced the ritual, a ghost in embroidered silk. And though no decree was issued, no proclamation made, every noble now understood. Death had walked the halls in slippers, bowed before its victim, and vanished into applause. The death of the Vicomte did not strike Versailles like lightning. It echoed, reverberated through minds already attuned to treachery by a name that clung to the ceilings like mildew: Brinvilliers. Only 4 years had passed since the Marquise de Brinvilliers, elegant and pious to the eye, had been marched through the streets of Paris in rags, her flesh smeared with the ashes of her victims, her crimes proclaimed aloud for a crowd that swayed between horror and fascination. She had been no monster in appearances, devout, charitable, but her legacy was one of dripping chalices and long, slow deaths. Her father died first, then her 2 brothers, all of them gasping, writhing, their wealth funneled into her hands like a dark inheritance. When authorities uncovered her connection to a network of apothecaries and so-called succor women dealing in secret powders and love philters, it cracked open a world that polite society had chosen not to see, one where poison was as common as perfume, and vengeance could be stirred into soup. Her trial had exposed the fragility of aristocratic immunity. Her confession, painfully extracted, publicly performed, had detailed how easily murder could be wrapped in lace and poured from a bottle. She had described not only her own acts, but a marketplace of death thriving in Parisian cellars, where nobles and courtiers sought remedies not from priests or physicians, but from poisoners' women with scorched hands and eyes like inkwells who promised solutions that left no bruise. Her execution in 1676 had been theatrical and grotesque. She was beheaded and then burned, the crowd roaring as if to expel some evil from the collective soul of France. But the effect had not been cleansing. It had been awakening. From that moment on, the French elite had begun to view death through a new lens, not as fate, but as a weapon. A death from illness? Perhaps. But perhaps not. Perhaps the illness had been placed there, drop by drop, gesture by gesture. And so when the Vicomte's body cooled and the stories slithered through the walls of Versailles, they did not arrive as a shock, but as a confirmation. They whispered not just of his end, but of her shadow Brinvilliers, reborn in another hand, another vial, another ambition. Her name became an incantation in antechambers, her memory a specter that curled around the pillars of power. If she, a woman of high blood and polished manners, could traffic in such darkness, who else might be tempted? What smiles now concealed the same hunger? What rivals now eyed their peers not with disdain, but with calculation? Versailles had learned its lesson, that in a court where power was everything, and proximity to the king determined the shape of one's fate, Murder was not the domain of madmen, it was a strategy. And the Marquise had merely been the first to be caught, or perhaps the first to be sacrificed. The Vicomte's death had opened a vein, and what flowed from it was not merely grief or gossip, but a mounting sickness that infected the entire court, a sickness not of the body, but of belief. Within a fortnight, whispers hardened into pattern, and pattern into fear. A second nobleman, the Marquis de Montchevreuil, took violently ill during a hunt, retching bile and blood into the underbrush, while his attendants whispered prayers and crossed themselves. He died before reaching the palace gates. Days later, a young maid in the queen's chamber collapsed while pouring rosewater into a basin, her lips blue, her limbs jerking as if tugged by invisible strings. And then came the most chilling of alla disappearance. The Comtesse de Bussy, known for her sharp tongue and her frequent, unsubtle comments about the rivalries between certain royal mistresses, simply vanished. Her chamber door was found bolted from within. No body, no trace, no note. Only the lingering perfume of violets and an untouched plate of figs. As these events unfurled with dreadful rhythm, the court's attention shifted from mourning to mistrust. Every death was now suspect. Every illness a potential omen. Court physicians, once considered mere servants to hygiene and constitution, now became objects of scrutiny or reverence depending on the hour. Some nobles demanded their own food tasters, others turned to astrologers and alchemists, asking if the stars themselves might offer protection from human malice. One apothecary, Nicolas Moreau, became an overnight sensation when he claimed to have devised an antidote to all known poison. Cheese services were booked for months, his mixtures fetching prices once reserved for Italian silks. Meanwhile, a quiet exodus began among household staff. Kitchen boys fled in the night, gardeners vanished without notice. Those who remained moved with the frightened care of animals sensing fire beneath the floorboards. In the salons, talk of diplomacy and fashion gave way to anxious mutterings about belladonna, arsenic, aqua tofana. Ladies' fans fluttered not from heat but from dread, and guests watched each other's hands more closely than the harpsichordist's fingers. A glance too sharp, a cough too sudden, and suspicion rooted itself like mold in brocade. Meanwhile, street pamphlets in Paris began to name names, some real, some invented, blending scandal and sorcery in equal measure. It was said that fortune-tellers in the Rue de la Tannerie sold not only visions but poison, and that noble women with barren wombs or cuckolded husbands were their best clients. Even priests whispered caution from the pulpit, warning of unnatural hands in God's order. Versailles no longer glittered, it shimmered with sweat. And through it all, Louis XIV remained outwardly serene, his court frozen in its orbit, still performing its rituals, still bowing, still smiling. But beneath every bow was a question, and behind every smile, a reckoning. The panic had taken hold not because of what had happened, but because no one knew what might happen next or to whom. When even the mirrors of Versailles seemed to reflect suspicion, Louis XIV moved not with fury, but with calculated precision, as a man who understood that fear, left to fester, could corrode a throne more surely than war. He did not call for open trials or sweeping edicts. He summoned shadows. In March of 1679, the king reactivated an old instrument of medieval justice, the Chambre Ardente, the burning court, a tribunal so named not for its firelit chambers, but for the sentences it handed down. Ostensibly a court of inquiry, it operated under a different sky than normal justice. Convened in a wing of the Arsenal in Paris, away from Versailles' gilded symmetry, it was staffed not by independent jurists but by men loyal to the crown and to the terrifying task set before them. At its head sat Gabriel Nicolas de la Reynie, the king's lieutenant general of police, a man both incorruptible and unflinching, who viewed human sin as a rot that must be cauterized. His orders were clear: uncover the poisoners, dismantle their networks, and silence the scandal before it touched the golden hem of the monarchy. The Chambre's methods were veiled in secrecy. Proceedings were closed to the public, transcripts sealed, witnesses questioned in windowless rooms beneath the flicker of torchlight. No accused was permitted counsel. No verdict was subject to appeal. A name, once uttered within its walls, was marked. The net spread quickly. Suspects were plucked from every stratum of society. Apothecaries, midwives, gamblers, priests, noblewomen, stable boys. Some were charged with murder, others with conspiracy. Still others merely with knowledge. The court did not distinguish between those who poisoned and those who failed to report it. A single letter found in a drawer, a single vial uncovered beneath a mattress, was enough to summon the guards. Homes were searched without warrant. Servants were tortured until they spoke, or until their bodies broke and their minds fractured. The tools of the Chambre were not metaphorical. They included racks, thumbscrews, red-hot pincers, and a boot that crushed bone with hydraulic inevitability. Testimony gathered under such circumstances was rarely coherent, often contradictory, but it was abundant, and each new confession added another knot to the web. Rumors whispered that those condemned were not always guilty, only inconvenient, that jealous husbands named their rivals, that spurned lovers cried poison to settle scores. But the Chambre recorded only verdicts, not motives, and its records, when not locked away in royal vaults, vanished entirely. What began as a pursuit of justice became a theater of control. The fear of poison expanded to fear of the state itself, an invisible tribunal, watching from behind its own mirror. Versailles may have shimmered with gold, but in Paris, where the burnings were prepared and the interrogations whispered like prayers, the color of power had turned to ash. In less than a year, over 150 arrests were made, and the king, from his perfumed throne, received their names one by one, as if cataloguing a plague. The Sun King had turned his light inward and, in doing so, cast the longest shadows yet. It was not the alchemists or the charlatans that brought dread to the marrow of Versailles, nor even the confirmed poisoners. No. The true terror came with the name that should never have passed the lips of the accused, and yet now crackled in the air like a curse. Montespan, Madame de Montespan. The very sound of it brought conversations to a halt, sent wine goblets trembling in the hands of dukes, and drove icy silences through rooms that had once buzzed with her laughter. For years she had stood at the center of the Sun King's affections, dazzling, sharp-tongued, imperiusa woman who knew how to use beauty as a lever and wit as a dagger. She was the mother of his children, the mistress who shared not only his bed but his secrets. And now, in the sulphur-lit recesses of the Chambre Ardente, her name emerged from the mouths of the condemned like smoke from a cracked censer. First it was La Voisin, the fortune-teller turned supplier of poison and performer of rites, who hinted under duress that someone close to the king had commissioned spells. Then came Françoise Filastri, tortured and trembling, who uttered it outright, that Montespan had attended black masses, had lain on a consecrated altar while prayers were chanted backwards, that she had offered up pigeons and blood in exchange for the king's enduring love. The allegations spread like fire in an opera house. They said she paid for love philters, that she cursed rivals, especially the Duchesse de Fontanges, the young beauty who now occupied the king's eye, that she had, once, asked for a powder that could kill. The court reeled. It was not just a mistress now under scrutiny, but the architecture of royal desire itself. The implications were blasphemous. Could the woman who shaped the king's moods and whispered in his ear over supper have dabbled in satanic rites? Had the king, unknowingly or not, slept beside the devil's apprentice? Louis XIV, ever obsessed with image, moved swiftly to cauterize the wound before it bled into the public's gaze. The official records were trimmed, redacted, sealed. Witnesses were silenced or executed before their testimonies could spread further. Montespan's name was scrubbed from transcripts where possible, replaced with elliptical euphemisms like a person of rank or a lady of influence. But words, once spoken, cannot be unsaid. In salons and confessionals, in shadowed galleries and behind gloved hands, her name became legend. Madame Scorpion, some called her, or the Black Marquise. She did not fall immediately. Her position remained intact for now, her apartment still warm with tapestries and candlelight. But something vital had shifted. Courtiers ceased to visit her in such numbers. Friends became scarce. The king grew cold, not in open dismissal, but in a drifting chill like the final warmth of a dying fire. And as Montespan walked the mirrored halls she once ruled, every reflection seemed to hold a question. Had she summoned love or summoned death? Either way, the name that once commanded envy now inspired dread. and Versailles, once deaf to consequence, had finally begun to listen. Beneath the marbled elegance of Versailles and far beyond the lantern-lit carriages that carried nobility through the grand boulevards of Paris, there pulsed a darker, subterranean world, a labyrinth of stinking alleys, unmarked doors, and smoke-choked parlors where the currency was desperation and the wares were death. It was a marketplace that wore 1,000 faces: healer, seer, herbalist, midwife, confessor. But at its core, it trafficked in something simpler: solutions. Lavoisin, whose real name was Catherine Monvoisin, reigned over this world not with crowns or titles but with whispered promises and the meticulous efficiency of a merchant queen. Her house on the Rue de Beauregard served many roles: apothecary by day, chapel of inversion by night. Aristocrats arrived under veils, cloaked and anonymous, sometimes alone, sometimes escorted by men with swords and haunted eyes. They sought powders to kill husbands, draughts to seduce kings, brews to induce miscarriages when lineage became inconvenient. The vials were small, often hidden inside rosaries, rings, or snuff boxes. Their contents bore names meant to veil their violence: inheritance powder, widow's ash, the drop of peace. In the cramped back rooms, candles flickered over jars of desiccated toads, crushed glass, ground bones, and sulphurous herbs smuggled in from distant ports. The air stank of rot, myrrh, and ambition. Language here was a veil. No one said murder. They spoke instead of deliverance, of release, of eliminating an obstacle. The clients were not the ragged poor but the silk-draped elite, some of whom had supped with the king that very week. Alongside Lavoisin operated a constellation of accomplices, men like Adam Lesage, an alchemist who promised transformation through flame, and women like Catherine Trianon, who claimed to summon spirits that whispered the names of enemies fated to die. There were priests who had long since traded salvation for coin, and apothecaries who prepared poisons in the same mortar as love potions. Meetings were often held at midnight, in candlelit rooms beneath butcher shops or abandoned crypts. Ledgers were burned after transactions. Payment was made in gold, jewels, or occasionally secrets. A mistress might offer the name of a rival in exchange for a swift solution. A courtier might promise land if his brother's claim were silenced. And always, the faces remained turned away, names left unspoken, guilt smeared across gloves and perfumes. Paris, city of light, had developed a second, inverted Sula cathedral of shadows that fed on Versailles' games of status and seduction. Lavoisin herself claimed no malice, only service. "I give people what they ask for," she once reportedly said. Nothing more. But behind her calm demeanor lay a woman who knew she stood at the center of a storm that now pulled bodies into its vortex faster than she could bury the ashes. And as the Chambre Ardente's investigators widened their dragnet, this underworld, once silent, fluid, and invisible, began to fracture. Names were spoken, doors were broken down, and those who had dealt in discreet death now found themselves caught in a far more public reckoning. The secrets they had buried were clawing their way to the surface. The pursuit of truth within the walls of the Chambre Ardente did not rely on persuasion or logic, but on agony, kind of theological arithmetic by which pain was expected to extract purity from corruption, as if the soul, cracked open by suffering, would spill its secrets freely. Suspects, once cloaked in the silks of noble lineage or the anonymity of the Parisian underworld, found themselves stripped to bare flesh and bound in iron, their dignity unraveled alongside their confessions. The methods were as methodical as they were medieval. The strappadowere wrists were bound behind the back, and the accused hoisted into the air only to be dropped suddenly, left shoulders shattered and nerves severed. The boot, a device of oaken planks and steel wedges, crushed shin bones until marrow leaked like sap from a ruined tree. The brodequin, a variant used for women, twisted the knees apart with such force that the screams echoed through stone walls long after the flesh had split. It was beneath such torment that tongues loosened and accusations multiplied, not as reasoned statements but as frenzied pleas for mercy. Lavoisin named clients with trembling lips: countesses, chevaliers, even a bishop. Her daughter, Marguerite Monvoisin, wept as she recounted black masses where infants were allegedly slaughtered, and their blood used to anoint the bellies of infertile noblewomen. Philastra, a gaunt, trembling creature whose eyes no longer focused in tandem, confessed to summoning demons with Latin incantations written in menstrual blood. The testimonies bled into each other, contradictions knotting with consistency in a macabre tapestry of guilt. Some claimed that Madame de Montespan drank the blood of pigeons before seducing the king. Others swore they saw noblemen kneel before altars bearing the severed hands of thieves. One man claimed to have burned a wax effigy of a rival duke, only to witness the duke's real body convulse and collapse weeks later at court. There were names, hundreds of names, some uttered only once, and others repeated like sacred chants. But for all their grotesquerie, these confessions bore a strange power. They were believed, if not always by the judges, then by those who needed belief to justify what came next, and what came next was ruin. Families fell, titles were stripped, estates seized, reputation, in Versailles, was currency, and the torture chambers of the arsenal minted new paupers every day. Yet within this chaos, one truth became undeniable. Whether or not the devils had been summoned, the destruction they wrought was real. Children were orphaned, wives disappeared, lovers turned witness. And always, the fire of confession consumed more than it illuminated. The line between the imagined and the actual dissolved, and in that blur, the crown found both its vengeance and its shield. For what better way to cauterize a scandal than to drown it in a flood of horrors so vast, so depraved, that the court itself seemed almost innocent by comparison? Thus did pain beget testimony, and testimony beget terror, in a cycle that fed not on justice but on fear, spectacle, and the machinery of silence. It was in the darkest chambers of testimony, whispered through broken teeth, clawed from ruined throats, etched in fevered memory, that the accusations reached their most unholy crescendo. For what began as a hunt for poisoners now bloomed into a vision of Versailles soaked in blasphemy. The term Black Mass was no longer confined to ecclesiastical paranoia, became a banner under which nightmares were confessed, a liturgy of desecration in which nobles, desperate for favor or vengeance, were said to consort with shadows. According to multiple testimonies, many torn from flesh in the torture cellars of the arsenal rituals had taken place in ruined chapels, private parlors, even cellars beneath the homes of fortune-tellers, where altars were constructed not from stone but from the naked bodies of women. The most damning claim came from Marguerite Monvoisin, daughter of Lavoisin herself, who recounted seeing Madame de Montespan lie bare upon such an altar, her arms outstretched like a crucifix, while a defrocked priest in blood-stained vestments muttered Latin phrases in reverse. Upon her abdomen rested a chalice. Above her, a newborn wailed briefly, before its throat was cut and its blood drained into the cup to be mixed with wine, powdered bones, and herbs meant to cloud the will. The king's name, according to this account, was spoken 3 times, each invocation a prayer for his enduring lover, his sudden death, depending on the petitioner's design. Another witness, Françoise Filastre, described attending a ritual where wax effigies of the king and his mistress, the Duchesse de Fontainebleau, were pierced with pins and slowly melted over candle flames while the congregation chanted curses. Others told of consecrated hosts stolen from church altars and ground beneath the heels of women as they shrieked their desires to unseen forces. The goal, always, was the same: to bend power to human will, to weaponize the sacred, to rewrite fate in blood. Whether such rites occurred as described or were stitched together from half-memories, rumor, and the demands of torturers mattered little. Their power lay not in their truth, but in their horror. That nobles might pray for regicide while bathing in perfume, that courtiers might offer infants to hell beneath the gaze of golden crucifixes, shattered the illusion of Versailles as divine order made flesh. If even half of what was spoken in the chambers of the Chambre Ardente was believed, and it meant that the king's court was not merely vulnerable to corruption, but soaked in it. More than poison, more than treason, the Black Mass allegation suggested that France itself had been desecrated, its soul mortgaged in exchange for lust and power. And the most terrifying question of all, left unspoken in gilded salons and behind velvet drapes, was not whether these rituals had occurred but whether they had worked. Had the Sun King's heart, his passions, even his crown, been manipulated by unholy hands? And if so, what price would heaven demand in retribution? The air at Versailles had never smelled so sweet, nor so foul. She was not a noblewoman, not a lady of Versailles, yet her name moved through the corridors of power with a weight that defied rank. Catherine Trianon, known in the alleyways and apothecaries of Paris as a midwife, a seer, a provider of tinctures for the desperate and the damned. She had stood alongside La Voisin in the black constellation of poisoners and conjurers, her hands stained not with blood but with the slow drip of complicity, with formulas whispered into trembling ears and herbs ground into dust beneath pestles long worn smooth. When she was finally arrested in the spring of 1680, it was not with fanfare but with quiet terror. Those who knew her or feared her understood that if her mouth opened, more than a few doors at court would slam shut in dread. In the cold confines of her cell, beneath the vaulted ceilings of the arsenal, she was questioned, pressed, urged to confirm what others had already hinted, that she had supplied poisons to courtiers, prepared charms for Madame de Montespan, and stood witness to at least one blasphemous rite. But unlike the others, Catherine Trianon did not break. She refused the ritual of confession, denied the grotesqueries laid at her feet, and met each accusation with a calmness that unnerved her interrogators. Then, one morning, the guards found her hanging from a length of linen, her feet inches from the floor, her eyes wide and glassy, staring at something beyond reach. The suicide sent a jolt through the chambers of power, not because of the act itself, but because of its implications. No note was left, no final declaration, only silence. And in that silence bloomed 1,000 questions. Had she ended her life out of guilt? Or was it despair at what awaited her, a slow death by torture, her dignity flayed away confession by confession? Or worse still, had someone ensured her silence? A hidden hand, fearful of what truths she might yet release under pressure? Her death became a specter that haunted both the Chambre Ardente and the court itself. With her died a web of connections, a tangle of knowledge that could never be unraveled. She had moved in circles that overlapped with the intimate lives of the aristocracy, and if she had spoken freely, no one knew how deep the rot would be shown to run. In salons, her name was never uttered aloud, but her absence was felt like a cold draught through the palace. Montespan herself, already diminished, withdrew further, as if Catherine's death had been a warning shot that found its mark. For all the pageantry and law, Versailles now lived in the shadow of a woman who had left no testimony. Only a question mark hung from a beam. And that question, what did she know, and whom did it damn, continued to grow, unchecked and unanswered, until it no longer needed words at all. It had become part of the air, part of the walls, part of the glittering silence that wrapped itself around the Sun King's court like a noose made of gold. While Versailles twisted inward in dreadful silence, Paris convulsed with nausea, clamorous, breathless hunger that echoed through its markets, alleyways, and cafes like the rattle of drums before a parade of death. The affair of the poisons had escaped the confines of courtroom and crown. It had become theater, and the public could not look away. Every new arrest was fodder for pamphleteers who inked sensational tales faster than truth could keep pace, their leaflets devoured on street corners like bread in famine. La Voisin's face, once obscured beneath a widow's veil, now stared from crude woodcuts that showed her brewing cauldrons beneath inverted crosses or handing vials to shadowy figures in wigs. Hawkers shouted headlines in rhyme, blending sorcery with scandal. The king's whore bids devils swarm. While ink-stained children ran between taverns distributing broadsheets thick with fabricated testimonies and monstrous exaggerations. In the cafes of the Marais, merchants debated which noble would fall next. In the salons of the left bank, libertines and laundresses alike speculated whether the queen herself was safe. The trials, though hidden behind closed doors, leaked in whispers, sometimes deliberately, sometimes through bribed guards or talkative scribes. Executions became public spectacles, drawing crowds as vast as those for royal processions. When Madame Vigoureux was burned, spectators arrived hours early, clutching rosaries or snacks, eager to watch the fire claim flesh. The scent of burning fabric mingled with roasted chestnuts. No longer merely justice, the process had become a purification ritual for the city itself, a pageant in which sin was named, dragged into daylight, and destroyed before an audience desperate to see evil punished, not with nuance, but with flame. The government, sensing the power of this bloodlust, neither dampened it nor denied it. Ministers who once lamented the destabilizing nature of gossip now quietly sanctioned pamphlets that shifted blame away from high-ranking nobles and onto a demonized underclass of midwives, alchemists, and fortune-tellers. Better, they reasoned, that the public tear at witches than question how close to the throne these poisons had come. Meanwhile, the real machinery of the trials continued in secret, with names redacted and testimonies buried. But the crowd cared little for accuracy. They wanted horror. They wanted names. They wanted ash. And while the Sun King busied himself with the maintenance of grandeur, the people feasted on the theater of his court's unraveling, delighting in the notion that even those who lived behind gilded walls might end upon a pyre. In this grotesque democracy of dread, duchesses and beggars were equal if only for a moment, if only as rumors. And as the gossip grew louder, the machinery of state slowed. Diplomats found their correspondence delayed. Ministers watched with dismay as audiences thinned, attention drawn elsewhere. The business of empire now competed with the business of spectacle. France had become a stage, and the affair of the poisons its most popular production. In every pew, cellar, and boudoir, the refrain was the same: who would be burned next and who deserved it? She remained, for a time, as if nothing had changed, her silhouette still haunting the gilded halls of Versailles, her voice still laced with the sharp wit that once made kings and bishops flinch. But those who watched closely could see it unraveling, thread by thread, the slow disrobing of a woman once clad in the full armor of royal favor. Madame de Montespan, the former maîtresse en titre, once the gravitational center of courtly life, no longer occupied the first seat at entertainments. Her invitations became fewer, her corridors quieter. The king, her king, who had once penned her verses and summoned her with impatience, now met her with rehearsed politeness and eyes already turned elsewhere. He never spoke of the accusations, never once allowed the name Montespan to be uttered in connection with the horrors unearthed in the Chambre Ardente. But omission is its own kind of verdict. Her apartments remained lavish, her titles intact, but they rang hollow. Madame de Maintenon, governess to her children and rival cloaked in virtue, gradually took her place not as mistress in the flesh, but as consort in spirit. The king sought piety now, discipline, order. Montespan had become a symbol of something Versailles wished to forget. Her charisma curdled into bitterness, her once fierce charm now sharpened into suspicion. She was not banished. That would have been too crude, too public. Instead, she was permitted to fade. Her own pride, once a crown, became a chain. She protested, subtly at first, then openly, until the king ceased to respond at all. She remained at court for nearly a decade more, tolerated but never trusted, attended but never truly seen. And then, in 1691, she asked to retire from court. The request was granted swiftly. Her departure was framed as a retreat into piety, a noblewoman choosing God over the vanities of the world. But Versailles understood. She entered the convent of the Field de Saint-Joseph not as a penitent, but as an exilia queen deposed by silence. Even in retreat, her name carried weight, but it was the weight of caution, not reverence. When she died in 1707, her funeral was marked with dignity but not mourning. The king did not attend. No monument bore her face in the gardens she once ruled. She left behind children legitimized but shadowed, wealth ample but uncelebrated, and a legacy so entangled in scandal that her very name became a cipher spoken only in hushed tones, or not at all. What had begun as ambition had ended as warning. Montespan's fall was not a collapse but a slow sinking, a woman swallowed by the court she once commanded. Her fate echoed through Versailles not as thunder, but as mist, the kind that lingers just above the floor, obscuring everything, even the steps that once led to power. Versailles, once a palace that throbbed with laughter, flirtation, and the rustle of secrets passed hand to hand like contraband lace, began to still not with peace, but with precision. In the aftermath of the poison affair and the quiet exile of Madame de Montespan, the Sun King's court entered a new phase, not less opulent, but infinitely more watchful. The salons, once alive with speculation and games of wit, grew tense with calculation. Private gatherings dwindled. Impromptu suppers were now rare. Every guest list triple-checked. Every conversation filtered through layers of decorum and second-guessing. The palace remained full, yet felt hollow, its rituals unchanged, yet hollowed out by fear. No one wished to be seen alone with the wrong person. No one dared to joke too loudly or inquire too deeply. Trust, that most fragile and valuable commodity, became scarcer than the king's attention. Those whose names had fluttered too close to the poison scandal vanished not with spectacle, but with silence. A marquis renowned for his interest in Egyptian mysticism simply stopped appearing at court. A lady rumored to have worn amulets beneath her corset to summon love was quietly married off to a provincial noble and never seen again. Even respected astrologers and physicians, once prized for their insights and strange tonics, found themselves coldly dismissed, their services no longer welcome. Books on alchemy were removed from private libraries. Cards bearing symbols of the tarot were burned. Louis XIV, ever the architect of spectacle, now demanded a new image of his court: clean, rational, pious. Where once he had entertained mystics, now he embraced mathematicians. Where once he had allowed his courtiers to trade in whispers and charms, now he demanded theological purity and public virtue. The Versailles of the 1680s bore no resemblance to the febrile, intoxicating court of decades prior. Its music still played, its fountains still danced, but beneath the beauty ran a brittle stillness, the kind that follows a fire. Women who had once consulted Lavoisin for love potions now clutched rosaries with white-knuckled piety. Men who had exchanged secret toasts to Saturn and Mars now extolled the virtues of discipline, obedience, and the divine right of kings. Even those untouched by the scandal had been transformed. The shadow of accusation hung too heavily. Every smile was vetted, every letter reread before sending. Versailles had learned that beauty could kill, that charm could conceal daggers, and that ambition, left to bloom in the dark, bore only venom. And so it adapted, shedding its old skin of sensuality and sorcery in favor of austerity, control, and a relentless vigilance. In doing so, it became more orderly but also colder, more brittle. The palace still glittered in the sunlight, but inside, beneath the mirrors and the silk, it had calcified. The fire had passed. Yes, but the smoke never truly left. It lingered in corners, in memories, in the hesitant pauses between phrases, a constant reminder that once, death had walked here in perfume and brocade, and no one had seen it coming. Versailles, once a palace that throbbed with laughter, flirtation, and the rustle of secrets passed hand to hand like contraband lace, began to still not with peace, but with precision. In the aftermath of the poison affair and the quiet exile of Madame de Montespan, the Sun King's court entered a new phase, not less opulent, but infinitely more watchful. The salons, once alive with speculation and games of wit, grew tense with calculation. Private gatherings dwindled. Impromptu suppers were now rare. Every guest list triple-checked. Every conversation filtered through layers of decorum and second-guessing. The palace remained full, yet felt hollow, its rituals unchanged, yet hollowed out by fear. No one wished to be seen alone with the wrong person. No one dared to joke too loudly or inquire too deeply. Trust, that most fragile and valuable commodity, became scarcer than the king's attention. Those whose names had fluttered too close to the poison scandal vanished not with spectacle, but with silence. A marquis renowned for his interest in Egyptian mysticism simply stopped appearing at court. A lady rumored to have worn amulets beneath her corset to summon love was quietly married off to a provincial noble and never seen again. Even respected astrologers and physicians, once prized for their insights and strange tonics, found themselves coldly dismissed, their services no longer welcome. Books on alchemy were removed from private libraries. Cards bearing symbols of the tarot were burned. Louis XIV, ever the architect of spectacle, now demanded a new image of his court: clean, rational, pious. Where once he had entertained mystics, now he embraced mathematicians. Where once he had allowed his courtiers to trade in whispers and charms, now he demanded theological purity and public virtue. The Versailles of the 1680s bore no resemblance to the febrile, intoxicating court of decades prior. Its music still played, its fountains still danced, but beneath the beauty ran a brittle stillness, the kind that follows a fire. Women who had once consulted Lavoisin for love potions now clutched rosaries with white-knuckled piety. Men who had exchanged secret toasts to Saturn and Mars now extolled the virtues of discipline, obedience, and the divine right of kings. Even those untouched by the scandal had been transformed. The shadow of accusation hung too heavily. Every smile was vetted, every letter reread before sending. Versailles had learned that beauty could kill, that charm could conceal daggers, and that ambition, left to bloom in the dark, bore only venom. And so it adapted, shedding its old skin of sensuality and sorcery in favor of austerity, control, and a relentless vigilance. In doing so, it became more orderly but also colder, more brittle. The palace still glittered in the sunlight, but inside, beneath the mirrors and the silk, it had calcified. The fire had passed, yes, but the smoke never truly left. It lingered in corners, in memories, in the hesitant pauses between phrases, a constant reminder that once death had walked here in perfume and brocade, and no one had seen it coming. What remained, after the fires cooled and the gallows stood empty, was not clarity but a residue, a poisoned legacy that seeped into the very bones of Louis XIV's reign and calcified there, invisible but omnipresent, like arsenic in fine sugar. Though the Sun King emerged untouched in image, his court forever bore the mark of what had transpired beneath its gilded ceilings. Justice, once a spectacle of royal magnificence, was now a sealed process, its judgments cloaked in silence, its authority centralized in the figure of the monarch himself. The Chambre Ardente had shown him the danger of letting rot fester outside the scope of his gaze, and from that moment on, all power, legal, moral, spiritual, was drawn tighter into the golden core of his person. Parliaments were further restrained. Dissent became not merely unwelcome, but dangerous. The mask of absolutism grew thicker, the smile less forgiving. And yet, behind that veneer of stability, Versailles changed in ways the king himself could not entirely predict. The court's rituals endured, but they had become brittle performances played out against a backdrop of mutual mistrust. Every servant might be a spy. Every rival might be a poisoner. Every cough, every fever, every miscarriage was suspect. The idea that death could be brewed in a teacup or brushed onto a glove left an indelible scar on the psyche of the nobility. Even joy felt laced with menace. The arts, once encouraged to flirt with mysticism and myth, turned inward, coldly classical, stripped of ambiguity. The king's building projects emphasized order and symmetry, but no longer intoxication. His later court, dominated by piety and hierarchy, lacked the dangerous magic that had once made Versailles a glittering volcano of ambition and vice. Montespan's children, though legitimized, carried the weight of their mother's unspoken crimes. The surviving accused, though silenced, haunted the court like revenants. Louis himself, ever more withdrawn, found solace in religion and routine, as if each day's exactitude could ward off the chaos he had once allowed to bloom. And the people, those far from the palace, who had devoured the trials like serialized tragedy, learned a new lesson, that beneath even the most luminous crown, shadows cluster. That power does not purify. That the same hands that build fountains may crush skulls when the throne feels threatened. In the end, the affair of the poisons did not topple the monarchy, but it did something subtler, something deeper. It altered the alchemy of trust. It redefined danger not as something foreign or open, but domestic and hidden, folded into silken letters and shared goblets. The legacy was not only in policy, but in atmosphere. Versailles remained beautiful, but it no longer dazzled. It watched. It listened. And within its scented corridors, no one ever truly drank first. The Sun King had survived his court's darkest hour, but from that moment on, he ruled not from radiance, but from dread, cloaked in the golden illusion that all was well, while beneath the surface, every shadow whispered, "Remember."